Okay, so today we're going to start uh, our study of the book of Hosea, and we'll do an introduction and I'm sure we'll get through it all, an intro, and also cover chapter one. And I want to start by showing you again the timeline that we can thank Mark for finding it. It's really good. We're at this part of the timeline right now. Jeroboam the second. You can see down below Jeroboam the second, about halfway through his term as king. Amos started in, and a little bit later than that is when Hosea, who ministered or prophesied for a long time through several kings. The last 12 books of the Old Testament are called the Minor Prophets. It's not news to anyone who's here. And they're called minor prophets because of the length of their books. And that's another thing that's not going to be news to anyone. They're also called the 12. And just for fun, I took out one of my Bibles and I checked how many pages there were in the 12 minor prophets. And in this particular Bible, and it would depend on the print, your Bible might be different, but the ratio will be the same. There were 55 pages total in all 12 of the minor prophets. And then I went and looked at Jeremiah. Jeremiah has 70 pages, and Isaiah had 68. So you can see easily why they're called the minor prophets, because of their length or lack thereof about the length. We don't really know anything about Hosea except for what's in this book that he wrote. And Hosea, the Hebrew word means salvation. Uh, there are some definitions, some dictionaries say deliverer. Some say the Lord has rescued. They're all, different dictionaries will sometimes show different meanings, but they're all pretty much the same. But what I found interesting was that his name is exactly the same as this last king here. The Hebrew word is Hosea. Now, for some reason, the translators and printers, and I'm not sure who we get to lay this one on, felt that it was necessary to spell the name of the man that wrote the book, Hosea, and the king was Hosea, but it's the same Hebrew word. Now we find something else that's a little interesting. I thought in Numbers 13:8, we find that Joshua's name is also the same Hebrew word, Hosea. Here in Numbers 13:8, when it was talking about we're picking out these men to do from the tribe of Ephraim, Hosea the son of Nun, or Joshua the son of Nun. And in Numbers 13:16, it says, these are the names of the men who Moses sent to spy the land. But Moses called Hosea the son of Nun Joshua. So I was a little surprised to find that out in preparing for today's study. Well, nothing is known about Hosea's background except that we know his father, and his name was Beeri, Beeri, that Hosea was married to a woman named Gomer, and they had children with her. Other than those tidbits, we really don't know anything about Hosea's personal life. He did live in the north, the northern tribes that we call Israel, and his ministry was during the last years of that nation. And I'll call it a nation. And there's not a lot of information that I found to to prove that. Although, it's pretty. I think most people are pretty sure that he was up in the north. Hosea 7:5, he calls the king of the north. That's not the prophetic king of the north. That's the king of the northern tribes. On the day of our king, the princes became sick with, and so on. So it's pretty well uh, determined by most people that Hosea was a prophet living in the north. Now, in the first 3 chapters of this book, Hosea compared, well, God put the words in his mouth, but Hosea compared the relationship between God and his people to that of a husband and his wife, drawing a parallel between spiritual and marital unfaithfulness. Now, I've mentioned to some of you all that I'm going out on a limb here, and I'm going to make a statement, and you all jump in and disagree and tell me I'm crazy, whatever you want to do. But I find that the first 3 chapters in the book of Hosea to not necessarily be for the nation of Israel. It was metaphors. It was uh, showing Hosea what God, the analogies or the metaphors that he was making, because he wasn't really speaking to the nation of Israel in the first 3 chapters. So I just wonder how many Israelites, how many of people in the north would have figured out that when Hosea married Gomer and had children, and how many of them would have figured out the metaphor? I don't think many. Maybe his closest friends. So it just seems to me that the first 3 chapters are for Hosea to understand God's message that he's about to give to the Israelites later on. And that's the way I see it. It isn't until chapter 4 that Hosea begins speaking to the people. So, I know I'm out on a limb here, but I just don't see how the people would have caught the message of the metaphor without Hosea saying anything. So there's one of my limbs. Any comments to that?
I don't know. We'll find out as you get into it. I know Mark has mentioned we thought that uh, Hosea is probably more poetic than Amos was in terms of its prose, and so we're probably seeing that here in the first several chapters.
Yeah, and the next sentence that I have in my notes is, as Mark has said, much of the
Of
Old
course, I
Testament.
have a comment.
Okay, go.
So the comment is about your point that this was for Hosea. My comment is that are the first 3 chapters. Yes, but if we think that Hosea did this in a vacuum and nobody saw it, we are very mistaken. After all, accounts of people's lives aren't measured over a period of a day, a few days, a few months. Sometimes the account of a person and what they go through, of course, lasts for years and even a lifetime. And therefore, it seems to me that the great God is working out something here that's going to have an impact on those people or the people in Israel about what this meant. And you're rightly said that Hosea had to come out and hit them in the middle of between the eyes. But while he may not have spoken about this as he was going through it, Surely this was noted by people, his neighbors, the city, whatever it was, because it's an awful story. It really is an awful story, a tragic, tragic story that could hardly be missed by the people around him.
I kind of agree with Mark. I mean, people have to, I mean, anybody that knew him would say, why would you marry that woman? And why did you name those kids the way you did? You know, so even though maybe it wasn't a direct preaching to people, it had to be a whole bunch of folks that got the message before, if you will, the formal preaching.
Yeah, there would have been a small audience that would have caught it. His friends would have said, "Why?" Just like y'all said. It just seems to me that like this is nothing like Amos. Amos came right out and just jumped all over them and said, "You all are the scum of the earth." And Hosea doesn't say that until about the third chapter. But so I agree that there were people who understood this, but I'm wondering if maybe maybe not the reason, but a big reason I think why God had Hosea do this is so he would understand and that his words would have more meaning when he spoke to the nation as a whole. But yet I agree with what both of you all said. It's just interesting to me that he doesn't really get on their case till about the third chapter. And also back to what Marcus said about poetry and musical form. Uh, it's my understanding, based on reading some of the commentaries, that the first and third chapters of Hosea are written in prose, just plain English, but the rest of the book is in poetic form. And of course, we'll see that as we go through this. So, okay, I think I survived that one. I don't know if I landed on my feet or not, but anyway. All right, so let's take a look at chapter 1. The word of Yahweh, which came to Hosea the son of Beeri during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash, king of Israel. This really struck me as, well, why in the world would he name 1, 2, 3, 4 kings of Judah and only one king of Israel? He's in Israel. He's in the in the north, and God has called him to speak to the people in the north. Well, a lot of the writers of the scriptures, particularly in First and Second Kings and Chronicles and so on, date their books based on who kings were. And in this case, he's dating his book based on, or his ministry, I suppose, based on the days of these 4 kings of Judah, and then just mentions the one king of Israel. And you can see here Hosea's ministry started toward the tail end of Jeroboam II's reign, went through Zechariah, Shallum, Menahem, Pekahiah, Pekah, and Hoshea, the last king um, of Israel. I mean, it was a long time. It was like 30 or 40 years. But he didn't mention any of them except for Jeroboam II. Now, one of the commentaries, or it may have been more than one, but one of them said that maybe it was to, and please note those words, they even said maybe it was meant to support the lineage of King David, because all of these down here, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, were descendants of King David, which supports what God told David. You're going to have a king sitting on the throne, that's in your family. So this is one of those we don't know things. We don't know why he mentions the kings of the north, but doesn't really mention kings of the south, but doesn't really mention the kings of the north. But this timeline shows us that Hosea is preaching in Israel, while Isaiah at the same time hears Isaiah. About halfway through Hosea's ministry, Isaiah came on the scene, and his ministry was to the south. Notice the green in the middle of Isaiah shows that he was a prophet to the south, and Hosea's line in the middle is yellow, showing he was a prophet to the north. So Hosea and Isaiah were preaching at the same time for quite a while, several years. So Hosea was a contemporary, as you can see here, of Amos, Micah, and Isaiah. His ministry began during the long and stable reign of King Jeroboam II, but it started toward the tail end of it. And one source said that Hosea was the only writing prophet who was raised in and ministered to the northern kingdom. Now, I tried to find other sources of that and couldn't, but it does make sense that he's in the north and he's speaking to the north. So I don't have a real problem with that. Now, Jeroboam II was an evil king, just like so many of the other kings of the northern tribes. He was a strong and capable leader, and he was a good military man, and he was able to expand the boundaries of Israel like they were when David was king. Now, was God behind this? Certainly he didn't stop it, but God's pretty much at the end of his rope here at this time, as our little cliche says. So I don't know if God was still blessing the northern tribes at this point during Jeroboam's term, or if he just wasn't stopping it. Another one of those things we don't really know. But Jeroboam II's reign brought great wealth to many Israelites, but left many others destitute. We studied this for 5 or 6 weeks when we were studying the book of Amos, because Amos spoke often of the social injustices that not only produced but increased over time the gap between the rich and the poor in Israel. And Jeroboam II died early in Hosea's ministry, as you can see right here. It's only, a year or so, a couple of years, that Jeroboam was still alive during Hosea's ministry. So 6 kings reigned during Israel's last 25 or 30 years. But the prosperity that Israel had during Jeroboam II's reign never returned. It went away when Jeroboam died. There was no good leader anymore. As a matter of fact, you can see Zechariah and Shallum, they, as I've said before, they didn't even have time to get their king cards printed. Hosea was God's messenger in Israel's final days, and he was pretty much the only one. Amos was there for a little while. Now, God called Hosea while Israel, they were at their political peak. but his ministry lasted all the way to Israel's lowest point out here at the end of Hosea's reign, when Assyria came in and took them away. So Hosea witnessed against Israel's people, prophets, priests, public leaders, and even the king. And Michael has mentioned this several times, that in 1st and 2nd Kings, the emphasis was on how the kings acted, what the king did. But in Amos and Hosea, we hear more about how the people sinned. So, like Amos, the purpose of Hosea's ministry was to denounce sin and to warn them of impending judgment. But he doesn't, in Hosea's case, he doesn't start talking about that till the 3rd chapter. Now, using marital adultery as a metaphor, Hosea accused the nation of being unfaithful to its vows that were made back at Mount Sinai, back in when we read the book of Deuteronomy. And by participating in these pagan rites, the fertility rites and things of Baalism, the people had violated their covenant with Yahweh. And God was done with these people. He was done with the kings. He was done with their priests. He was done with their holy days. He was just done with the northern tribes. So their covenant relationship with God is at the heart of Hosea's message, that they had broken. And God had delivered the nation from slavery in Egypt. He had established them as a nation and had taken delight in them. They were his people. He loved the nation of Israel before the split. And he still loved them after the split, but his patience with them began to wane. I don't know if that's a fair way to put it, but the people were ungrateful. They didn't care about all the things that God had done for their ancestors. What have you done for me lately? And oh, by the way, it's so much fun to go into the temple and do the things that they did in the temple. And I'm not talking about God's temple down in Jerusalem. I'm talking about these little temples, particularly one in Dan up in the north where a golden calf was, and a temple in the south in Bethel where a golden calf was. They'd forgotten all the miracles that God had performed on their nation's behalf, or maybe they just chose to ignore them. But at any rate, they had turned to other gods, little g, little e Elohims, and they started looking. The kings, here's where the kings made some big mistakes. They looked for alliances with foreign nations to help them out of a mess instead of looking to God. And God, through Hosea, tells them about it. I think he also told them about it in the book of Amos. So now verse 2, here's where Yahweh tells Hosea, here's what I want you to do. And as Mark said, this was terrible. When Yahweh first spoke through Hosea, the Lord Yahweh said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord." The word harlotry is used 3 times in verse 2. Now, this flagrant harlotry, word's hard to say, spoken of is that they had departed from Yahweh. I mean, they had totally kicked him out. Sort of like what we're seeing today in schools and in courthouses and so on. Our country is slowly kicking God out of our well, I guess out of our lives, hopefully not our lives, but many lives. And this is a result of what Jeroboam did day one. Now, I say day one kind of facetiously, but it was early in Jeroboam the first's reign in the northern tribes that he began to cut the people off from temple worship in Jerusalem. He didn't want them going back because he was afraid he was going to lose his kingship, I suppose. But he didn't have to do that. God would have been with him. God would have preserved his kingdom. It would have been a great nation. It may have even been a greater nation than Judah. But nope, he wasn't happy with that. He was the man. He wanted to be in charge. He wanted to be the one that everybody looked up to. So he started changing things. Now, the only thing that the scripture tells us is about the two calves and about the Feast of Tabernacles. We don't know what other changes were made, but I'd be willing to bet you a nickel that there were a lot of other changes that were made by Jeroboam. So we are now seeing, after a couple hundred years, the result of Jeroboam's actions. Now, bear in mind as we go through Hosea that the marriage analogy is just that. It's an analogy. And the reason it's used is because marriage is a covenant, and Israel had broken covenant with God. I don't know if you all can see that, but I have this thing that pops up every once in a while. Now, there's been a lot of debate. It was interesting to read in different commentaries the different beliefs or thoughts of the commentaries about the circumstances of Hosea's marriage. Some of the commentaries or some scholars say that this is all a vision, that it's allegory. It's not literal. But you just can't see that when reading it. There's not a word said about it being a vision or an allegory. Well, it is now. There's nothing that's said in the book of Hosea that would lead anyone, I don't think, to believe that this was a vision. But
Hey, Skip.
yeah, Skip. Yep.
Is it possible once we get through this book that we go back and revisit this question? When we take the entire book in context, after we've gone through it, can we come back, make a note, and let's revisit this question again, and then maybe have discussion about whether or not this may be more metaphorical as far as the people of Israel rather than applying it specifically to Hosea.
Okay.
Just a thought.
Okay.
That might help instruct us in terms of whether these is what we're reading here is actually an application to Israel breaking the covenant rather than and how Yahweh Elohim is viewing Israel versus what he's telling Hosea himself to do.
Well, and let me give you kind of I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Okay. Now part two of this is that not only are there some commentaries and scholars who believe that this is not literal, but when they look at Gomer, there are different approaches or different understandings about who she was or who, so some argue that Gomer was a prostitute at the time that she married Hosea. Some view her as a young Israelite woman who, because of the pagan Baal worship that was going on, that she had participated in a rite of sexual initiation in preparation for her marriage. Others contend that Gomer was a virgin at the time of her marriage and later became unfaithful. And then one more view is that Gomer had been married before and had been put away because of an adulterous affair. But guess what? Hosea doesn't provide us the answer to those questions. So when we do come back to this, let's take all of that into consideration. Also,
Skip,
yeah, Barb.
well, it's probably pretty hard for a lot of us to think that God would tell Hosea to marry a prostitute. I mean, it just doesn't seem to fit. At least doesn't fit God's way of doing things.
I agree, and this is one of the reasons why I look at the first three chapters a little different than some of you all. I think that these first three chapters were written more for people who read the book later on. Now, one of the things that I have in my notes that I'll go ahead and mention right now is that when the northern tribes were taken captive, were taken away to Assyria, Hosea and some of his friends or comrades or whatever went down to Judah, and it was there that this book was written after the fact. Of course, I guess all prophetic books are written after the fact, but well, or you all know what I'm saying. So
Here's an interesting view. Can I
sure,
interrupt here?
please.
So this let's see, what am I reading here? I am reading out of the New Bible Commentary, and it says that the straightforward meaning would be to marry a prostitute / fornicator. But it is unlikely that Hosea would be commanded to do something so much against the law. Perhaps, therefore, it means marry someone who comes from a situation where prostitution is normal, or more likely, marry someone who will turn out to be a prostitute. In other words, Hosea looking back on his broken marriage, sees it as God's will that he should have married such a person. So that ties in with what you're talking about, him writing down in Judah or something like that, right?
Yeah, and it makes more sense, like what Barb was saying. It's hard to see God telling Hosea to break the law like this, but it makes more sense that, well, what you just read. I don't want to go back and quote, but that seems to be the best way for me to look at it anyway. That she wasn't a prostitute when they got married, and I don't think even became a prostitute later on. I think she was just unfaithful, and God is using this. And I know we've talked about this before, and I firmly believe that the writers of all of these books wrote them for the people that were there right then and there, blah, blah, blah. But there's also things that we can learn from them. And so if she, which I don't think was a prostitute when Hosea married her, the analogy of an unfaithful wife and Israel being unfaithful to God seems to make some sense. And I don't know if I'm making any sense, but anyway, so this book was written later as Hosea looked back, like what Mark just read. Okay, now I have to say this: does it matter?
Yeah, this whole question goes back to the question of, is everything that is written in the Bible absolutely literal, or is there figurative learning that we can understand? You know, we've talked in the past about when the scripture says something like, everyone did such and such, or nobody was left, the whole land was empty, you know, that sort of thing. There are exaggerations that are put into the scripture. It's the way that they express things, etc. And this could be seen in the same way as having certainly a figurative point of view, and something that's looked back on. You know, how many of us have taken an assessment of our lives by looking back and saying, you know, I couldn't see it when I was going through it, but now after years I see that such and such and such has happened, and I learned a lesson after years and years and years.
Yeah. That's that. Yeah, I mean, all of us have done that. I'm sure that was a little hyperbole there too, wasn't it? Okay, so we've run into another we don't know principle. You know, we don't know. We've what have we looked at? 5 different ways to look at this. 4 different ways. What, you know, does that matter? What matters is that we learn this lesson. That we learn that God expects us to obey Him. He expects our nation to obey Him. And when I say, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to Israel. He expected the Israelites to obey Him. He expected them to live a life respecting their neighbors, respecting God, loving their neighbors, loving God, and so on. So, what we do know from these first 3 chapters, or at least chapter 1, is that Hosea's marriage played an important part in his prophetic ministry. Going on to verse 3. And 3, 4, and 5 kind of go together. So he went and took Gomer. Okay, so he marries Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So the first child was Hosea's. Yeah, I think we can be pretty sure about that. Not so sure about the others, but pretty sure that this one was his son. And Yahweh said to him, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to name him Jezreel." Now, one of the things that we've lost is to have meanings of our names. In the scriptures, everybody's name meant something. And for a long time, you know, post biblical times, names meant something, but then after a while, they didn't. My name has a meaning, but it's not what people think when they say, well, my real name's Joseph, which means, I think, warrior of God or something like that, I think. But nobody looks at my name that way. Well, one reason is because I don't go by Joseph, but that's, you know, every name in scripture and every location, and I'm getting into hyperbole here, has a meaning. And this naming him Jezreel takes us back to some stuff which we studied a few months ago, or probably a few months ago. So Yahweh said to Hosea, I want you to name your son Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I'll put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. 2 different things. On that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now, you all may remember, or I'm sure you do, when we were studying about this, how Yahweh told Elisha to anoint Jehu king of Israel. Now, I said Elisha. I'm pretty sure it was Elisha. It may have been Elijah, but anyway, he was told to anoint this man Jehu king of Israel. Now, this was years before Jehu became the king of Israel. Jehu and some of his buddies were playing cards and drinking beer, and in walks this prophet and says, "Come here, I want to talk to you." And he took him in another room and he anointed him king. And you can imagine what Jehu thought. What in the world? How in the world am I going to be king? Well, he did become king. So he gave him a job to do. And the job was to eliminate the entire family of Ahab. Now, that's all he told him to do. Okay. Said, I want you to destroy every, it says male, basically, in the house of Ahab. So much later, when Jehu was king, he went a lot farther than what God had told him to do initially. He said, I want you to wipe out the family of Ahab. And Jehu just went crazy, killing everybody. I mean, you didn't walk up that, you didn't want to walk up and say, hey, Jehu, how you doing? Because you're about to be dead. The first thing that Jehu did was he went out in the valley of Jezreel and he killed Joram, I believe it was, the son of Ahab and Jezebel. I may be getting my names wrong, y'all. Please forgive me. I'm trying to make the point, not necessarily the individual. I want to be correct on everything. But anyway, he killed him and killed his entourage. And then, because Hosea, the king of Judah, happened to be up there visiting his cousin, Jehu wiped out the king of the south and his entourage. Then he went and he wiped out all the priests of Baal. And finally he goes and he has Jezebel thrown out her her upper story window. And God wasn't happy about this because while getting rid of the prophets of Baal may have been okay, God didn't want him to wipe out everybody he came across, particularly since that one of the things that happened here, which was really, really bad, was when Jehu killed Ahaziah, the king of Judah. Ahaziah's mommy got pretty upset about it. Her name was Athaliah, and her mom and dad were Ahab and Jezebel. And she basically became the leader of Judah. And her first act was to kill all the descendants of David that she could find, and she found every one of them but one. And he was hidden in the temple for 6 years. So while Jehu did what God told him to do, he went way too far. And that's why we're reading here in Hosea verse 4, chapter 1, verse 4, name him Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu. So yeah, Jehu, you got rid of Ahab, but guess what? Same thing's going to happen to you and your family. In verse 10, in 2 Kings 10:30, this is the part that Jehu did right. He says, Yahweh said to Jehu, because you've done well in executing what's right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. And I was supposed to have, there it is. Okay, so here's, I need the whole thing. There we go. Here's Jehu. And then his son Jehoash, and I think Jeroboam the second were descendants of Jehu. So this is what Yahweh told Jehu that he was going to do. Okay. But we find that God was very unhappy with Jehu and says that he will end the line of Jehu because of his bloodshed. Remember, David got in trouble. God called him a bloody man. You're not going to build my temple. I'll let your son build my temple. I don't even want the temple, but you guys seem to be just possessed with building me a temple. So fine, but it's not going to be David. So God said that he would end the line of Jehu because of his bloodshed in Jezreel by killing many who God did not intend for him to kill. He went too far. He did what God told him to do, but then he went way too far. Okay, so now we're down in verse 6. And so Hosea and Gomer have another child. We don't know if this is Hosea's child or not, but she conceived again, or I say we don't know at this point anyway. Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and Yahweh said to him, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. Now we heard this from Amos, that God was done with them, and now we're hearing it from Hosea. God is done with Israel, and he's done with his almost unending compassion for his people because they have totally abandoned him. He didn't abandon them, they abandoned him. But then he says something interesting in verse 7. He says, but I'll have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by Yahweh their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. So I back up to verse 6 and go, no, okay, no, wait a minute. We've been talking about Israel up to what? How did Judah jump into this conversation? In verse 7, when he says, I'll have compassion on the southern tribes. Well, when the Assyrians invaded the northern tribes and took the Israelites captive, that nation ceased to exist. I mean, it was no more. But some from the northern tribes escaped and ran to the south for protection. And this could have included Hosea, because I said earlier that Hosea went to Judah, and that's where the book Hosea was written. But anyway, so God says, I'm going to save Judah, even though the Assyrians came and besieged Jerusalem, because that's what happened. Assyria wasn't happy with just taking the northern tribes. They wanted Judah also, but God cut them off and sent them running back home. So Judah was given a reprieve in order to get it right, to worship the one true God, to tear down and destroy the groves and the Asherah that the people of the south were beginning to worship. But as we know, the reprieve was temporary. What was it, a couple hundred years? From 725 to 550 or something like that. All right, so now they're going to have another child. After Ruhamah was weaned, Gomer conceived. Doesn't say she and Hosea, it just says she conceived and gave birth to a son. And Yahweh said, named him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I'm not your God. Now, this is part of the reason why I'm wondering if some of the first few chapters are for later, because they'd already been told they weren't his people and he wasn't their God. They'd been told by Amos. They were beginning to be told by Hosea. So these words don't seem to me to be for the nation that's already been taken off, already been taken away. Again, that's just my opinion. And he goes on in verse 10. He says some things that we have read elsewhere in the scriptures. He says, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. We've read that before. I've got those some scriptures here in a minute, which cannot be measured or numbered. And then he says, and in the place where it said to them, you're not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. But where did he say you're not my people? Right here. He told Hosea, by this boy's name, like we were talking about earlier, some people understood the metaphors or analogy of the names that Hosea gave to his children. You are not my people and I'm not your God. So here in verse 10, he says, hey, down the road, there will come a time where it is said to them, where it was said to them, you're not my people, but it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. And this reminds me of something else that I'll get to in just a minute. And they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Here's Jezreel again. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Why is he mentioning Jezreel? Because Jezreel, he just talked about Jezreel being a bad place, but now he's mentioning when they go up from their land, great will be the day of Jezreel. Well, the word Jezreel means God sows or God makes fertile. For great will be the day that God makes fertile the nation of Israel. Now, verses 10 and 11 appear to be for a future time. I don't know how I could not think that they're for a future time. And last week we talked a little bit about Ezekiel 37. And again, this is how I see Ezekiel 37. But we'll get to that in a minute. Here's where God spoke to Abraham and said these words. For you said, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered. And we read this as quoted in Romans by Paul. As he also says in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. He's going to accept the people of Israel and Judah back. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you're not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. And then in verse 27, it says Isaiah. Okay, now he's talking about Isaiah in Romans. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, same thing, though, and he's quoting, Paul is quoting Isaiah, who's saying basically the same thing he's quoting Isaiah, who's saying the same thing that Hosea said, though the number of the sons of Israel are like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. So verse 11 speaks of Judah and Israel being gathered together. verse 11, and the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. And it just seems to me that it fits. And I know we didn't all agree 100% on this, but it just seems to me that it fits that Ezekiel 37 is possibly the time that Hosea is talking about. And I just want to run through this and we can discuss it. The word of Yahweh came again to me, saying, and you, son of man, take one stick and write on it for Judah and for the sons of Israel, his companions, and take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel. The northern tribes were sometimes called Joseph, sometimes called Ephraim, and his companion. Then join them for yourselves one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. And when the sons of your people speak to you, saying, will you not declare to us what you mean? What are you talking about? What is this thing about these two sticks? Say to them, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim and the tribes of Israel, and I will put them with the stick of Judah and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. The sticks on which you write will be in your hand before their eyes. And say to them, I'm going to take the sons of Israel from among the nations, because after Assyria had kept Israel in captivity, they released them and they spread out all over the world. And it says, behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they've gone, and I'll gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. This seems to be a prophecy of a future event. And I'll make them one nation on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king for all of them, and they will no longer be two nations and no longer divided into two kingdoms. They will no longer defile themselves with their idols or with their detestable things or with any of their transgressions, but I'm going to deliver them from all their dwelling places in which they have sinned. Wherever they are, whatever gods they've worshiped, I'm going to deliver them. I will cleanse them, and they will be my people, and I will be their God. And that's the end of my notes for today. Comments, corrections, thoughts? It's interesting. There's always a pregnant silence before somebody steps up and says something.
I have a quick question, going back to the beginning of the discussion. I have an echo here. Do you guys hear an echo?
Just a
No.
slight one, not bad.
Okay.
Everybody mute their mics, including Skip. Let me figure out how.
No, Wade's on your place. Wade's on your place.
Oh, okay.
Mute. I'm going to mute one of his mics. There we go. All right, go ahead, Wade.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
No,
Obviously,
it's terrible.
Oh,
yeah. What's going on?
it's coming in clear for me.
Skip's mic sounds good, but
Well, let me mute
It's
myself.
bad.
This is something with GoToMeeting. Oh, wait a minute. That's better. Although I should not be hearing. Testing. Yeah, no, this is not right. How about now? I should not be hearing myself. Testing. No. There'll be a glitch, folks. Did we lose everybody?
I'm here. I'm just trying to give you time to see what's going on.
This is kind of glitch with the software skip. Every mic is muted and speaking, but for some reason it's coming through in a feedback loop. Yeah, but Skip's muted now also, Brian. Skip, Brian asked you to try muting the computer itself.
To do what?
Mute your computer. See if that solves problems.
Okay. The only way that I can do that is to turn my microphone off. I mean, my speaker off completely. I'm
Let's
going
try
to.
that real quick. How about now? No, I'm still hearing myself. Yeah, no, something's wrong. Because I should not be hearing myself when I speak. And I am. No, something's wrong.
Let's restart the meeting.
That's a good idea.
Restart what? The meeting?
The meeting.
Yeah, I can do that. Does everybody, everybody can tune back in? Is that what you want to do?
Let's try and see if that changes the problem.
Okay. I'm shutting this down and then I'll restart.